Okay, good to go. Love the thumbs up. Okay, good morning, everyone. You probably heard in the background, I apologize. My name is Abbhinav Muralidharan. I go by Abbhi. And today I'm going to be talking about the role of a flight controller in human spaceflight. I want to start off by apologizing. I tend to use a lot of acronyms, having worked at NASA for not that long. So I've tried to expand on everything that's in the presentation. But if there is an acronym I inadvertently use, just raise your hand and call me out on it. And I also apologize. I know a lot of my co-presenters will probably have really cool pictures of space hardware. As flight controllers, we don't really interact that much with hardware, but we fly it, which I think is really cool. I wanted to start off by thanking the SEDS team for organizing this event in the virtual environment. And let's get started. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about my background at the University of Michigan, talking about the mission that I'm working on, Artemis 1. Go a little bit into what a real-time operations team consists of, the plan, train, fly philosophy at the Johnson Space Center, which is where I work, some flight controller skills that we look for. We deal a lot with risk, operational risk, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and a day in the life of a flight controller. So a little bit about my background. I graduated from the University of Michigan back in 2017, so I don't know if I can be called a recent grad anymore, but I did my undergrad and my master's both at the university. On campus, I was involved in a number of student organizations. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these, MBurst, Embark. The one I'd like to highlight is Engineering 100. I actually created a new section of the class with Professor Aaron Ridley. I think it's called Electronics for Atmospheric and Space Measurements. But it's basically a high altitude balloon class for undergrads, and it was awesome. While I was on campus, I did do 4 co-op semesters at the NASA Johnson Space Center. They're called the Pathways Internship Program, for any of you who are aware. I did 2 summers and 2 semesters, and the final semester of that was with the group that I work with right now. So I'm currently an avionics flight controller at the NASA Johnson Space Center. I focus on the exploration programs, so that's the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System, the SLS rocket. I'm certified for ascent and entry, which are the dynamic phases of our flight. I'm also certified for low Earth orbit ops, lunar transit, and lunar orbit operations as well. My group's call sign is CDH, Command and Data Handling. I'm actually going to be a backroom support for this mission, so my call sign would be CDH support. On console, we have a lot of responsibilities, the CDH discipline. We are dealing with the primary flight computer architecture, the backup computer architecture, all the data paths internal to the vehicle, managing the automation of Orion. So Orion is an extremely complex vehicle, a lot more automated than anything that NASA Johnson Space Center has flown in the past. And given that the first mission is going to be a test flight, we're almost the managers of automation to ensure that it's not deviating from what we expect it to do. We do file management, uplinks and downlinks of data files from the spacecraft during the mission. A really cool aspect of this is we'll be the ones downlinking all the cool photos and videos that Orion takes when it's around the moon. We also manage time on board the spacecraft. Orion cannot use the GPS envelope for its time. So because it leaves the GPS envelope in the first 3 hours of its flight. So there's a lot of time management that we need to do for Orion. So just want to give you all a primer on what the Artemis 1 mission is. So the Artemis program is NASA's new program to land humans on the moon and have a sustainable lunar presence. Artemis 1 is going to be the first flight of this program. We're actually going to be sending Orion uncrewed, so without astronauts on board, around the moon for around 30 days. And it's going to be a really interesting mission profile. If you can see from this image, what we're going to be doing is sending Orion around the moon and doing a sort of a slingshot maneuver. So it's going to be going even further out and then coming back around the moon and then going back to Earth. So at its farthest point from the moon, it's actually going to be 70,000 kilometers from the lunar surface. So we're going to be sending this spacecraft further than Johnson Space Center has sent any human-rated spacecraft. And the cool part about it is that we're going to be controlling it entirely from the ground, which I think is pretty awesome. There are a number of objectives for Artemis 1 that I'll get into in the next slide. So for those of you familiar with space missions or really any kind of big project, you need to start off by defining your mission objectives. It's the same for Artemis 1. There are 3 main objectives for Artemis 1. There's a number of smaller ones as well, but these are the 3 ones that we're focusing on. So the first one is to demonstrate the heat shield performance at lunar re-entry velocities. So what that means is Orion has a heat shield that is used for when it's entering the Earth. What we want to do, though, is ensure that when it's doing this, it's coming from lunar orbit and using that re-entry speed, which is a lot more than coming in from low Earth orbit. So that's our number one objective for Artemis 1. The number two objective is to operate vehicle systems in a flight environment. So Orion is going to be sent really far out. There's going to be a lot of radiation in the environment that it's operating, and we have a lot of electronics on board as well. So we want to ensure that even with radiation hits to our electronics, any kind of bit flips, single event upsets, that Orion is still able to function normally. We're also going to be testing out the communications. Orion uses a radio frequency, and we want to make sure that it's at the distance that it is when it's really far away, it's actually able to still communicate effectively with the ground. And we're actually going to be stressing this Artemis 1 Orion spacecraft a lot more than we will be for the future Orion missions. And we're doing so because this one doesn't have astronauts on board. Artemis 2, the next mission, is going to be the first one with humans going around the moon. And Artemis 3, as it's currently slated, will be the first one to land humans on the moon. The third objective we have is to retrieve the Orion crew module. For all you engineers, I'm sure you know that there's nothing better than actually getting the vehicle when you're done and like ripping the guts out and doing all the analysis you can to ensure that you have a safe flight for the future Artemis missions. So flight control team, again, I want to keep stressing, and I will this entire presentation, this is a very small subsection of the entire flight control team. The flight control team, there's the flight director. They're the decision-making authority for anything that's happening in real-time operations. They will be calling the shots. They will be giving you the go for any command you want to send to the spacecraft. So they are the decision-making authority when you're in the real-time operating environment. They are supported by a team of flight controllers. Flight controllers are the experts in their system. They're the experts in their discipline. They're the ones that provide that systems level of expertise to the flight director to help them make those decisions. So we operate the vehicle, we command to the vehicle. Usually how flight control team works is that you have a front room flight controller. So for my discipline, that would be the CDH flight controller. And usually for non-test flights, you would occasionally have a backroom support. So you would have that for what we call complex operations. So things like docking, spacewalks. You want to have a second set of eyes during those critical phases of your mission. Artemis 1 being a test flight, we're actually going to have backroom support throughout the entire mission. So the backroom is a second set of eyes. They're equally experts in the system. They just make sure that the front room is sending the right commands, they're monitoring the right data, things like that. And I, again, want to stress that it takes a village. The photo you see is a very small subsection of the total number of people that will be operating the Orion spacecraft for Artemis 1. So what is plan, train, fly? You'll hear this all the time, and I did expand on this. We actually call it PTF, believe it or not. It's a very common acronym we use in the real-time world at Johnson Space Center. You can think of them as the 3 pillars that we use for our operations philosophy. So I'll get into each of these in the future slides, but I just kind of wanted to give you all a little bit of an overview. Planning, pretty straightforward. We're going to be ensuring that the vehicle performs as intended. We're going to be preparing for all the foreseeable mission contingencies. And I want to stress the word foreseeable here. So how do we foresee mission contingencies? At the Johnson Space Center, we've been operating with humans in space for 50 plus years at this point. So we use a lot of that institutional knowledge we've gained from operating humans in space to plan for any kind of mission contingencies that we can foresee happening. That being said, Orion is a different vehicle, and it's going to be flying in a different environment with a different level of automation. So we also want to get a little creative and think of other mission contingencies and really planning for those as well. And obviously the specialty of Johnson Space Center is the humans in space aspect. So we'll be performing a lot of human systems integration. So human factors assessments, working with the astronauts to make sure that what they're intending to do is how we plan to operate the vehicle. The training, you got to maintain expert knowledge on your system. That takes years to gain. And while we're trying to build this knowledge base, we're also trying to concurrently build a skill base. And when I say skill base, I'll get into that in a little bit, but it's really things like being able to have a headset in your ear and listen to 3 or 4 conversations at the same time, being able to take meticulous notes in the middle of a dynamic operation. Those are the kinds of skills that we want to cultivate in our flight controllers. And depending on your perspective, fun or scary, we also do spacecraft failure simulations. So this is a really fun, I think a really fun part of the job. what you would really do is for Orion, for example, we actually have an entire software model of the spacecraft, and you can have instructors from the back end inject malfunctions into the system to see how flight controllers respond. So that really tests, more so than your knowledge, your ability to understand how these systems interact. So the photo that that y'all saw of me back when I was sitting on console, that was actually after my final sim where I got my certification. And it was an Ascent sim where there were a lot of failures injected into the model, and I had to know how to respond and react appropriately. So that's training. And we love to use the phrase that you don't really rise to the level of your expectations, you always fall to the level of your training. Flying, that's pretty obvious. We operate human-rated spacecraft and we do it to ensure crew, vehicle, and mission success. So planning, I want to use the example of the Artemis 1 objectives, which is why I brought it up. So the number one objective, like I mentioned, was to ensure that you're able to test the heat shield at lunar reentry velocities. So what that means from a flight techniques discussions are always chaired by flight directors, and it's basically where we start to deciding how to operate a spacecraft. So for that specific mission objective, we're actually planning for Artemis 1 to go to a pretty low level of redundancy to ensure that we can still make it at least to the lunar orbit, not do the slingshot, but just make it to the lunar orbit and come back. So for that, for example, from the CDH, from the avionics perspective, we'll want to ensure that a number of flight computers are up and running to ensure this happens. So let's say we are okay with half of our computers being down to go to lunar orbit. Well, first of all, the flight director is going to ask you, what are the impacts of that happening? If you have half of your flight computers down, is that going to affect any part of this mission? So those are the kinds of discussions where, as the avionics system, we have to have that expertise to be able to answer questions like that from flight directors. So let's say we decide we're going to have half our computers down. What exactly is defined as a computer being down? That will be defined in things like flight rules. So flight rules, you can consider them as almost like an operational envelope. It's how we decide what is the state of our system and how we intend to use it. And flight rules are not developed in a vacuum of just the flight operations group. We will be consulting with engineering. We will be consulting with the safety team. We'll be consulting with the Orion program. We will be doing all this to ensure that everyone has agreed on a certain envelope for operations. So we don't need to be making those trade studies in real time. You do not want to be having those long drawn out conversations in a real-time environment when it's already a higher stress. So we have those conversations and define flight rules. So let's say we have a computer that's down. How do we try to fix it? How do we reset it? How do we power cycle it? Those are the kinds of things that are defined in procedures. The procedures will lay out, okay, this is a command you send to the spacecraft, and this data that you get will tell you that your command was successful or was unsuccessful. So procedures are also documented for making sure that we're able to actually operate the vehicle. So when I say we'll be able to get data from the spacecraft and analyze, Orion is sending down its data in ones and zeros. It's not in a human readable format. Our Mission Control Center at the Johnson Space Center will actually take those ones and zeros and be able to convert it into a human readable format. And we develop displays to be able to read data that Orion is sending us. So this is a very small snippet of all the operational products that we define when we plan for a mission. Outside of this, the Flight Ops Group, there we go, my first acronym. The Flight Ops Group is a very important stakeholder in different forums, technical forums, safety forums, any kind of integrated forums. We always want to be there to provide an operational perspective of, hey, if you're making this change to the vehicle, this is how it'll affect our operations. So a big part of our plan phase is also to be in these forums. For the training, I'm going to get into flight controller training in a little bit more in depth, but I just want to briefly touch on astronaut training. Astronauts are actually part of the Flight Ops Group at the Johnson Space Center, and we have separate training just for our astronauts. So astronauts are also required to be equally experts in our subsystems, but you have to keep in mind that they're going to be interfacing with the spacecraft in a very different way than the flight controllers are doing. So the astronauts have different objectives. They have to do science, they need to perform spacewalks, things like that. They're not going to be sitting and monitoring the spacecraft. That's our job. So we have an awesome team of instructors that actually create sometimes completely separate lessons to train the astronauts to be able to operate the spacecraft from space. And oftentimes we'll be in these failure simulations that I was mentioning earlier with the astronauts and working as a team. Flight controller training flow. I think it's pretty straightforward. So you start off with a boot camp. which is kind of what's the history of NASA, the history of the flight ops group, the history of the largest program we operate right now, which is actually the International Space Station. After that, we do have a technical knowledge gathering phase, which could last almost up to a year. So it's almost like an undergrad in a way. You're just learning about your system and how it operates and how it behaves and things like that. And concurrently, we're trying to develop those skills. We use the term soft skills. I don't know how soft they are because it does require a good amount of critical thinking and technical knowledge to be able to assess. But you do things like loop protocol. All flight controllers are versed in the native phonetic alphabet. We need to understand how to use terms like copy and Wilco and negative and affirmative. And you need to use that because that's how we communicate when we're on console in real-time operations. And it's kind of, you can think of it almost as a common language that allows for efficient communication. And I stress calm, calm, calm. As an engineer myself and as someone with a STEM background, obviously the stereotype is that we're not good communicators, which is absolutely not true. It's a broad generalization. But knowing how to communicate is very, very important as a flight controller. On-the-job training, OJTing, obviously there's an acronym for it. We do that a lot when we're training new people to kind of get them kind of a flavor of what it is to be a flight controller in a day in the life when they're on console. So how OJTing works is we'd actually have a trainee sit with an experienced flight controller when they're in the middle of like supporting a real-time vehicle like the space station. And we'll just have them observe for an entire shift. Like, what displays is this flight controller looking at? What are they writing down? What are they not writing down? What loops that they're listening to are they responding to? Which ones are they not responding to? Those are the kinds of things that you want OJT training to be looking at. Obviously, the fun part, spacecraft failure simulations. And you do this with increasing complexity as your training progresses. So when I started my training, I would actually go with only avionics systems failure. So you had a failure of a data path or a computer. But as my training progressed, now we'll be talking about more complex failures. So hey, a power bus went down. How does that affect your system? You lost cooling capability and now your avionics are heating up. Whatever your avionics are actually going to be causing problems. You want to think about other systems failures and how they impact you. So that's also part of the training flow that we go to. And we have oral boards, which are basically just a set of oral questions that the flight control team will ask you. I had my oral board earlier this year. It was just 4 hours of them asking me questions about avionics. So that was, I wouldn't call that as fun. And obviously the most forward-facing aspect of our job, flying. We operate extremely complex systems in the most extreme environments. And we do so to ensure crew, vehicle, and mission success. When we are supporting missions, we actually call it sitting console. And some of the big roles that flight controllers do is we command the spacecraft. We do so at predefined times. And we do so upon agreed upon operations, things like flight rules that dictate when you can command and when you cannot command. We're also monitoring the health and performance of our subsystem. And we have to be prepared to respond to any kind of off-nominal system issues, whether that's an actual failure or something that's trending towards a failure. So key flight controller skills, soft skills. I'm not sure how many of you are in the multidisciplinary design program at Michigan, but there is well, at least there was an acronym when I was a student. There's an acronym they use that's a DBT, design, build, test. So a very important skill as a flight controller is to realize that there's a lot more to it. It's you design, build, test, you realize it's not working, so you reiterate, and then you test, and then you reiterate, and then you test, and you keep doing that until you end up at a point where you can actually operate a spacecraft. So being comfortable with cyclical problem solving is very important as a flight controller. Another point that we always talk about is understanding how complex systems interact with each other. Using the same example that I mentioned earlier, if we're talking about a power bus failure on a spacecraft, how does that affect your avionics boxes that you're worried about? If it doesn't affect it and it affects something else, how does that impact your box? Like, those are the kinds of questions that you want to be asking yourself as you go through training as a flight controller. And I want to stress that this may sound kind of difficult, but no one comes into the flight control world having all these skills. These are all trained, and they're trained over years. So these are just important skills that it's always good to keep mind of. Situational awareness, again, an acronym we use, we call it SA. But being aware of all the different flight control disciplines and what they're doing when you're actually on console. So if there's another failure somewhere else and they're just talking about it, you should have the awareness that, hey, this could impact me, but maybe not. Let me just keep an ear out for it. Those are, again, kinds of skills that you get with constant training. And I want to stress it again, calm, calm, and calm. If you have an avionics box that's failed on you and the flight director is asking you what to do, you do not at that point want to get into a nuts and bolts conversation of what exactly the failure was. You want to talk to them about what the impact of that failure is to the entire spacecraft and what you're going to do about it. So knowing what to say and when to say it. That same issue, if you're talking in one of those forums I mentioned, where there's all these different stakeholders and they want to spend an entire day talking about it, that's not the time to be very brief. You want to really get into the nuts and bolts at that point. So calm, calm, and calm, very, very important. And obviously risk management and reduction. So what is risk? There's a very generic definition of risk. So it's basically the uncertainty that your outcome is going to deviate from the expectations you have. Traditionally, risk is always talked about as a numeric probability. In the real-time world, it is hard to assess what the actual numeric probability of your risk is. What you can assess is the severity of the outcome. So that's what we typically use in the real-time world when we're talking about assessing risk. We always use the next worst failure. So with that power bust down, like I keep going back to that example, the flight director's first question is going to be, what is the next worst thing that could happen? And those kinds of trade studies are what you need to be able to be comfortable with making on the spot. And if you really boil down the role of a flight controller and a flight director is someone who's presenting that risk. If the flight director is asking you that question, you need to be at a position where you're ready to present what are the different risks and what are the severities of those outcomes. As a flight director and the decision-making authority, you need to be comfortable managing the risk of all the different flight control teams and being able to present a rational go, no go for the entire vehicle. And I want to stress here that operations is the last link in an error chain. So you're talking about concept to research, to design, to manufacturing, to testing, verification, validation, all the way to operations. Controlling for risk at any of those prior steps is a lot better than trying to control it at operations. And we always tell our engineering counterparts that, like, do not try to protect for risk with using me. Like, you need to protect for risk when you're designing your system. And obviously we're limited by technical constraints, schedule constraints, budget constraints. So, I mean, we're talking about the real world environment here, but operations is something that's always a last link in that error chain. And also, I mean, this is, I guess, true for life as well. It's not always riskier to do nothing about a failure you see. I'm sure some of y'all are in CubeSat teams. I'm sure some CubeSat teams are going to be presenting for Space Symposium. In a CubeSat, I mean, if you break it down, you basically have a backplane and you have all these different circuit boards that are connected to it, right? So let's imagine a scenario where your backplane has a 5-volt line and that 5-volt line just fried. I mean, it just died on you when it's in space, right? You've lost some capability. You've probably lost some sensor measurements. Maybe you had 2 antennas and you lost one of them. So you're not in a great state. That being said, if I present to you that the only option you have is to actually turn off and on that backplane, that may not be the best decision to make, because if you turn something off, there's a non-zero likelihood that it's not going to turn back on. And if you just lose your backplane, now you've just lost the entire CubeSat. So those are the kinds of questions that a flight director is going to ask you as a flight controller is, hey, if you were to power cycle this, will it actually come back up? And if it doesn't, how bad is that going to affect our posture? So it's always something important, especially as someone who's new and like, whenever I would be in my first simulations, I'd always want to just jump at the gun and try to do something. It's sometimes important just to take a step back and realize that there isn't something you can always do about a failure. Sometimes you just have to deal with it and move on to the next aspect of the mission. I hate to not be able to provide a cookie cutter day in the life of what we do, because it is truly different every day. It depends on the day. Sometimes we have sims. We sometimes test with the actual spacecraft. The Orion spacecraft that's going to be flying in Artemis 1 is actually at the Kennedy Space Center right now. So we do have tests occasionally when we're uplinking and downlinking files to verify that we have a good connection with the spacecraft. That's very cool because you're interacting with actual space hardware. We have training classes, flight techniques discussions, which are a lot of fun, and it's just a really good insight into how we operate spacecraft. Meetings, which is true for any profession. And the really cool part, operating a human-rated spacecraft. So, do you want to be a flight controller? Thank you very much for giving me the time for the SETS team, and I'd like to open the floor to any questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Abbhi.
Absolutely.
Very informative. I don't know if I want to be a flight controller.
It's a lot of fun, trust me.
Yeah, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I have one to start off.
Sure.
So you said like, oh, it's not as hard as you would think because you're kind of preparing for it for a long time. But to me, it seems like a very high stress job. Or maybe it's like, you know, you're calm for a while and then something goes wrong and it's very high stress right at one moment. So how do you deal with that? And like, what's your first thought when something goes wrong?
Take a breath. For the most part. It depends, obviously, even taking a breath, it depends on the phase of flight, right? So if you're talking about for that final sim of mine, which was an ascent sim, sometimes you have like seconds to make a decision. Sometimes it's like 30 seconds. But really for most, like 99% of a mission, which is not ascent entry, because that's like 20 minutes total, you do have time. For most failures that you're talking about, you don't need to immediately jump on and do something. Sometimes like they might be like, hey, you know what, we're gonna wait 8 hours and just see what happens to this. This thing is kind of being fidgety, but it's not telling me anything bad. So I'm just gonna wait and see what happens. That is sometimes how it is. And that's honestly, for the most part, a lot of our failures, like they will take hours to for us to respond to. And we try not to like just command things like that because it, like I said, we could make the situation worse. And it's funny that you bring up like it stresses out the first time you think about it. It does feel, the first time that you deal with it, it does feel like it's turbulence on a plane. Like it's just kind of jolting out of your seat a little bit. But one thing that I like to talk to the interns about is whenever we have like our communications exercises, I play the fire scene from The Office. I don't know how many of y'all have seen Office, where like Dwight Schrute is like, stay calm, like be prepared, and like everyone's just going crazy. Like that's sometimes how it feels when you're like there for the first time. But over time, as you keep training for it, you almost train your body to be like, okay, responding to something that you see that doesn't look right. It's all about the training, really.
Right. And with that, do you feel like it's helped you in your, like the other aspects of your life? Like now if something goes wrong and your like car breaks down, you're like, oh, I can deal with this.
Yeah, no, I mean, it actually does. And that's like, we actually use the example of a car breaking down to like, if you see like your engine light or you see like a brake light or something when you start driving your car, like you have a very different assessment of how you're going to be operating this vehicle. Like, okay, maybe I need to go and think about like, what's the next worst failure? Like, what's the next thing that could happen that's going to make this worse? It's both good and bad, obviously. Like you don't want to be doing that with every aspect of your life, but it definitely does help dealing with stressful situations just through the skills we get, I guess. Yeah.
Right.
Nice. Yeah, we have a question in the chat from Ernie King, so I'll just read it off. How do you manage and train for incidents that may occur in interfaces between systems that don't fall entirely under one person's responsibility?
Oh, that's a really good question. It was actually interesting when we started building the space station, because we were talking about, even within NASA, you had two different flight control teams. You had the ISS team, and then you had the behemoth of the time, the space shuttle team. And talking about space shuttle dockings, any kind of EVAs, the coordination really rested on the flight director. The flight directors were in charge of doing that coordination. Currently, right now, if you want to take a more modern example, we're talking about vehicles like SpaceX Crew Dragon, or I guess they're called Northrop Grumman Innovation Systems, the cargo modules that we send to the space station. A lot of those that have flight control teams in their own area, like SpaceX has theirs at Hawthorne, they have their own flight director, but per our flight rules that were agreed upon by international partners and commercial partners, the flight director in Houston is the final decision-making authority for all of those operations. So they will have conversations amongst themselves if there's something that needs to happen in real-time coordination. But the MCCH, so MCC Houston, the Houston flight director, is the final decision-making authority. And that's kind of done to streamline not having too many folks making the decisions concurrently. I hope that answers the question.
I hope so too. Ernie, feel free to throw something in the chat if you have a follow-up. I guess one question I have, and let me know if you actually addressed this, I might have missed it. What's the process for like actually becoming a like as far as even just being selected to go through this training process of a flight controller? What did that look like for you?
So I kind of got it off a little easy because I went through the Pathways program. So for us, it was just the semester before well, I think it's 3 semesters for people with a STEM background. And then I did 4. And on my 4th one, I basically just went and spoke to the boss there. I was like, hey, can I work here full time? And that was really it. People intern outside. It's like pretty straightforward. Sorry. I think you were hoping for like a really epic story about it, but no, it was, yeah, I just went and spoke to him. For a lot of interns that want to apply just for 1 semester of doing it, you can still do it. And it's similar to other internships, right? Where you basically apply for it and then you get accepted, and then it just increases the likelihood of you working there full time. And if you're not interning and you just want to apply, it's really just how you're applying for another job. You apply through USA Jobs or through the different contractors we have, and then you get selected and go through the interview process and then go to training. I guess to kind of follow up on that a little bit, to answer your question, all the flight controllers have to go through the boot camp and all the training. And there could be some cases where flight controllers, as they're going through that training, feel like it's just not the right fit for them. And then there's ways that we can work around that, like reassigning them and things like that. But to actually apply for the job, it's very straightforward.
Great. Yeah, it's a good example there of just ask.
Just ask, yeah.
Just ask.
Yeah, I mean, that's usually the first step. Yep.
All right, we've got Amit coming in with a question. So he asks, with the modernization of vehicles and trend towards autonomy, how do you anticipate the role of flight changing, especially in cases where autonomy is relied upon, like for Gateway or a Mars station, where the light delay hinders human intervention in fault detection and control? Very long question, but I think that's a good one. I can repeat it too.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and that's something that we're trying to kind of define right now, because we are starting to get into that phase. With lunar operations, it's not as bad with the time delay of us responding to real-time events. But if we're talking about further out, like Martian human operations, yeah, it will be more of like a relied upon thing where the astronauts and the automation are what are relied upon more for failure detection and analysis. From the operations perspective, we still will need some kind of an operations team that are staffed for real-time operations, just because we're talking about humans in space, higher likelihood of a failure being really bad, more complex systems. So you definitely want, at least in the beginning, for there to be a flight control team. Just like I mentioned with Artemis 1, it is an automated vehicle, but we want to make sure that that automation is actually, I don't want to use the term behaving, but we actually expect it to perform as intended. Just for that monitoring capability, you do want the flight control team. But I will say for Artemis 1, the flight control team's nominal work is not as much as it probably would have been for earlier flight control missions. And that's because of the amount of automation that's happening. But we do play a very important role to make sure that if there is anything that happens, that we're there to prevent that failure from cascading into something worse. So I think that answers the question. Martian operations, it's like far out, so it's hard for me to predict what's going to happen with that. I'm sure there's going to be at least some kind of a core operations team. May not be as large and may not be supporting 24/7 like we do right now. But I do see a role of some kind of an operator interaction with those spacecraft as well.
Great, thanks.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, we've got some time still. We've got about 6 minutes until the start of our next talk. So we can sort of chill, but if anybody else has questions, we can. Yeah, do you have one?
I do have one.
Okay.
So to kind of like sandwich the like, how did you get here? So like, what is next when you decide to go into being a flight controller, going into operations? Like, what is the next step? Maybe personally, or maybe like in general, is it to be a front room controller, or like being support? Does that give you more flexibility to do, other things? I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely does make sense. So yeah, usually the standard route is you do a mission as a back room, and then you do your next mission, you try to get a front room certification. The front room certification isn't as much technically more complex. Like you're dealing with the same systems and you've gained that expertise as a backroom flight controller. What the front room role is doing is a lot more of being a communicator, like communicating the decisions of your group to everyone else. And that's what a lot of the training is for front room flight controllers. And if you're talking about vehicles like Orion SLS, where there's also the ascent and entry component to it, that'll be another certification that you can try to go for if you want to. The other option that some flight controllers do after getting their backroom certification is they actually go to the instructor route. So like, hey, you know what, I want to train astronauts. That's what I want to do. I need to still be a flight controller, like in the backroom, to at least get that perspective of what it is to operate vehicles. But after that, I'm just going to be part of an instructor corps that trains astronauts for different missions, and that's a pretty high number of people do that. It's not like everyone just goes to front room. A decent number of people, yeah, they become instructors. Outside of that, you could start doing more like subject matter expertise work. There are a couple of people in our team that do that. Some people are like the experts in flight software, and they become almost like a representative for all of the flight ops concerns for flight software for everyone. So there are like more technical, I guess, traditionally technical jobs that you could go for as well. But a lot of it starts from getting that first backroom certification, because that'll kind of define you as a flight controller.
Thanks, that makes sense.
Yep. It's like Wayne raised his hand.
Yes.
Thank you all for doing all the coordination of giving me these questions.
Of course. All right, Wayne.
Hey, yeah, this is Wayne Lester, one of Abbhi's good friends. I just wanted to throw in a little bit on that last answer that he gave. I was a flight controller as well for Lockheed Martin for about 1.5 years before I transitioned to Northrop Grumman now, working on the Halo mission. But so in terms of other positions too, after flight controller, so I made my transition to the one of the back shops, in which I did orbit mechanics. So kind of one of those specialized roles, using the same set of spacecraft that I was flight controlling. I then was able to plan out maneuvers and whether collision avoidance or perigee raises or other types of relocating of spacecraft type maneuvers. So I think that was a good segue into that, because I knew all of the mission architecture, I knew all the background, how the spacecrafts operated. So like Abbhi was saying, it's really good to get your feet wet and really get that good background and good high level con-op of what the mission is before then transitioning to something a little bit more technical and focused. So we have those kinds of roles as well as vehicle engineer related. So something like really being focused on thermal or the attitude determination and control system or some other kind of system. So yeah, a lot of different roles open up to you once you do flight controller.
Yeah, no, hey Wayne. Yeah, that's a great point, because it also like helps with understanding how all the different systems interact with each other. So if you want to go into something that's a little bit more of an expertise route, I mean, we have an entire team just for debris avoidance maneuvers for the space station that were all flight controllers for the topo discipline, and they all went and started doing debris avoidance maneuver, trajectory analysis, and all that. So it just helps having that kind of operations background and also just the systems awareness of your entire spacecraft.
Great. All right, so there's one more question in the chat, but Trevor, if you could maybe send that through the Slack, and then we can answer that there. We're gonna go ahead and switch over to our next speakers, which is M Rover, I believe.
Mhm.
So M Rover folks, we will give you access to share in just a minute.
Yeah. So much, Abbhi.